Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 32. While you're turning there, last time we saw some more examples of faith from chapter 11 last week. That was Joshua, who isn't named per se in those preceding verses, but Rahab is there. We saw that as the children of Israel began to enter the promised land, that God was going to test their faith. He was going to prove himself again, but they were going to have to do some things that didn't make any sense from a military strategy. For one, if they were going to defeat the city of Jericho, why would they march around it once a day for 6 days and just go back to camp? Because that would allow the residents of the city to leave, or they could go out and get supplies, or they could go send for other people, reinforcements from neighboring cities, and anything was possible. But that's what God told them to do, and so that's what they did. They circled it around, went back to their own camp. But they obeyed by faith. And then on the seventh day, instead of preserving as much energy as they could, God marched them around the whole city 7 times before they were going to attack, and they obeyed that by faith. So we said Jericho was one of the most fortified cities in all of the promised land. It's very hard to penetrate because the wall was elevated. The lower portion, more like a retaining wall. There's dirt behind it, so you couldn't bust through that. And then there's a double wall. The upper wall was just the outer wall. And then you've got some of the common people, the poorer people on the outside, then another wall and going in. And so it's hard to get in anyway there. But God wasn't trying to prove their ability, to prove that by sending them to maybe an easier city. God was proving His ability. And so God allows the walls to fall down flat, and they had to fall outward. We talked about that, or they wouldn't have any way to climb up in. And so, but one unlikely character who was spared in that attack was a harlot, a woman who had allowed the spies into her home and then hid them, protected them, and by faith she abandoned her own people and their beliefs to attach herself to the God of the Hebrew people there, and she and her household were spared. As we move into these next few verses of this chapter, we're going to cover some ground. There's a lot of people in these next few verses, and we're not going to read all of the accounts. The writer of Hebrews gives a really abbreviated version of it, but we're going to see some of these. Some of these are very famous people there, some a little less, but some of the situations that are described, we can attach names to. We know who those people are, even though their names aren't given, and some of them are just unknown. But they're all identified by their faith. And so there in Hebrews 11:32, we'll read down through verse 40 this evening. Hebrews 11:32, he says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah and of David also and Samuel and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." Now, we've talked about this several times, but because it's a continuing theme throughout this letter, we'll continue to do so. Judaism from the Old Testament was the religion that God established. It was the old covenant, the sacrificial system. That was pictures of Christ that were pointing them to Christ, and that's what it was supposed to do. It was never supposed to be the permanent plan. It was always just to point them to Christ. But it gradually changed into a works-based system. And so instead of believing by faith alone and using those things as a picture, they began to rely on the things for salvation. Now, if you circumcise your children, if you go to the 3 feasts every year, if you do these ceremonies, if you do these rituals, if you bring these sacrifices, if you do, if you do something, that saves you. And we've talked about over and over again. Even if they did the right ceremonies, even if they went to the celebrations, the feasts, the pictures of Christ, even if they brought the right sacrifice, if their heart wasn't right, what did that mean to God if they did all the right things? Nothing. You see over and over again where God says, I will not accept your sacrifices. I will not accept them. And it's because of the heart. The faith part is the part that matters. The rest is extraneous to that. It doesn't matter without the faith. The faith is the saving part. The faith is the important part. The others were just pictures of Christ. But because they changed it gradually, slowly, and people started believing, you just do these things, do the right things, obey the laws that God set, then that'll save you. And so that wasn't true. But by the time Jesus came to the earth and he presented the new covenant, which was just a change of the sacrifice. They went from a temporary sacrifice to a permanent sacrifice. And then the pictures or the shadows of Christ would go away after Christ came. They weren't necessary anymore. You didn't need priesthood anymore. You didn't need animal sacrifices. You didn't need those ceremonies. Those were pictures. And so they could go away. But when Christ presented the new covenant, those people who had thought the old covenant was now about works, when Jesus presented the new covenant, it looked like something brand new to them. Something they'd never heard of before. There's some new system of religion that was totally different from Judaism there. And that's why many of the Jews rejected it. They rejected Jesus. And that's how Satan wants to creep into true religion. It didn't happen overnight. Judaism didn't go from the true religion of God's people to a false religion overnight. It didn't. It happened slowly, gradually there. And that's what Satan wants. If things change fast, people notice, don't they? They notice. You see that with kids all the time. When you're around them all the time, they're growing up, you see them every day. They're changing every day, aren't they? Yeah, but it's that slow, gradual change. Right? And you go back and look at a picture from 6 months or a year ago, and you'll say, wow, they've really grown in that amount of time. Right? And those type of things. But when you're seeing them every day, you don't notice it so much. But now somebody who hasn't seen them in a few months or a year or something, and they see them and they go, what? That's the same kid? Right? And that's how it works there. But the more invested people had gotten into Judaism under that old system, when they thought it was a works-based system, right, the more they believed that, those were the people who were the most hostile toward Jesus when he came. Those are the ones, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, that were just looking for ways to kill him. And then the same thing with the apostles who followed after him and carried on that message. And so these next few examples of faith are kind of the pinnacle of it, because these involved, a lot of these were life or death kind of situations with these people. Now, some might argue that the last one was a life or death situation with Rahab. Right. But technically, hers wasn't a life or death situation. Hers was a fight or flight situation, because every time they circled the camp, on the first 6 days, what did she have opportunity to do if she chose? Leave, the same as every other resident of Jericho. They could have left. But what were they putting their faith in, everybody else in Jericho? They won't be able to get past them walls. We're just going to hunker down. We're going to stay right here. Nobody else can get in. They're not going to get in either. That's what they were putting their faith in. But so hers really wasn't a life or death situation. She could have left any day, those first 6 days there. But she chose not to. Now, Rahab could have been killed for treason for hiding the spies. That was a life or death situation there. But she didn't pass that test of faith, did she? No, when they asked her about the spies, what did she do? Lied. She lied. She says, they went out right before they shut the gates. Right, headed over that direction. If you go hurry quick, you can catch them. Right? She lied. So she failed that test of faith. That would have been a life or death situation for her, but she failed that. But, by the way, God never expects or wants us to sin to show our faith. Never. Never. She didn't have to do that. She chose to do that. But there are 6 men mentioned here in verse 32. There are 6 different people there. They're not in chronological order. So I don't know why, but they're not there. In chronological order, they would be Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, Samuel. Those were all judges of Israel. And then David, who was one of the kings. But all of those demonstrated faith, and we'll just take them in the order that they're given here. But Hebrews 11:32, he says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets." So Gideon's a familiar character to us. We could go back to Judges chapter 6 and see where God called Gideon. If you remember the story of Gideon there, when God sends the angel and calls him, he calls him a mighty man of valor. That's when God first called him through the angel there. Do you remember what Gideon was doing when God called him a mighty man of valor? He's hiding, threshing wheat. You remember where he's doing that at? Someplace you would never thresh wheat. Wine press. Why don't you thresh wheat in a wine press? Because you don't want the stubble and the chaff and things like that when you go to prepare grape juice. That's a miserable plan. And then you got to try to get it out of there. And in Bible times, not like they got a shop vac or something. They can go in there and just suck up all the chaff and clean that out. That's a miserable plan there. But the Midianites were the people that were oppressing them at that time. And they would go on these looting missions. They just go steal whatever they could, whether that was the harvest from a crop, animals that were out, anything they could find there, anything they couldn't use, right, or wasn't ready to be harvested. What did they do with the rest of it? Just destroyed it. They just destroyed it. Anything they could find that they couldn't use, they destroyed. They took the rest. Right? And so what Israel is doing there is they're hiding any place they can find. And the Midianites are trying to keep them weak. They're trying to keep them afraid. And the people are just living in dens in the mountains. They're living in caves, just any kind of hole or crack or crevice that they can hide in, and trying to preserve what little bit of food they can hang on to and keep the Midianites from coming and stealing there. And so the judges of Israel are all deliverers of the people. They're deliverers there. That makes them pictures of Christ. Christ is our Savior. He's our deliverer, right? Our judge and deliverer. But all the judges took on a military role because during that time, Israel would fall into idolatry. They'd get away from God. God would send one of those foreign nations to oppress them, right? And then they would repent, turn back to God, cry out to God for help. God would send a judge, a deliverer, and that was a military person there. And they were to instruct the people and then lead them to that victory. Now the Midianite army has 135,000 soldiers. You can see that in Judges 8 verse 10. He says, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of all the hosts of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew swords. So 120,000 were already killed in the initial battle. There's only 15,000 left, and you do that math there, that'll be 135,000 there to begin with. Right? How many soldiers did Israel have to start with? Well, if you back up to Judges 7, Verse 3, he says, now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned to the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000 there. So they started out with 32,000, and God gives them a way out. God says, too many of you. Right? And he tells Gideon, any of them that are afraid. It's 32,000 against 135,000 in the Midianite army. He says, any of them that are afraid, let them leave. 22,000 of them leave. They leave. There's only 10,000 left. Now, 32,000 against 135,000, that's not good odds. That's not. Right? That's a little more than 4 to 1. If you're a Midianite. 4 Midianites for every 1 Israelite. Now, it's not impossible odds, but God doesn't leave it at that. He narrowed it down to 10,000. You remember in Judges 7:7, and the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go every man unto his place. Now it's 300 Israelites against 135,000 Midianites. That odds is 450 to 1. Every Israelite has to kill 450 men each in order to win the battle, in order to be victorious. That is impossible odds. That's impossible odds. Right? They can just expect to get beat, not only beat, but slaughtered. But 300 men plus God, who's got the advantage then? It's God's side. It's God's side there. Now, normal military strategy, if you're outnumbered, if you've only got 300 men against 135,000 men, you would keep as many, or even if you started out with 32,000, you'd keep as many men as you could to start with. Right? Well, that's already out. God narrowed them down to 300 people there. The next best strategy, if you've only got 300 people, is you keep them as close together as you can so they can protect each other, watch each other's back, those type of things there. God doesn't do that either. God spreads them out. They actually go all around the Midianite camp. They're spread out all around that camp there. Right. So God's not maximizing their numbers. He's narrowing it down. He's not keeping them together. He's spreading them out. Right. So the next best military strategy was, how are you going to kill 135,000 people? Well, you're probably going to have to sneak up on them, right? You're going to have to sneak up on them, kill a few here, kill a few there, right? Run, come back. Guerrilla warfare. That's how they do guerrilla warfare, right? Just attack and run. Attack and run. And so that would be the next best scenario there, without being seen, without being noticed in some way. That's not God's plan either. That's not God's plan. Once they get around the camp of the Midianites, right, they're in the middle of the night. They could use darkness as a cover, but they're not going to stay hidden. Right? God's not going to allow that. They're not going to stay quiet either. God's not going to allow that either. This is what he tells them to do. Judges 7:20. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers and held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So they blow the trumpets, which lets them know where they're at. They break their pitchers. What was under the pitchers? Remember? Their torches. Right? Their torches. Right? So now You've blown the trumpets. You've let them know where you're at. You've broken the pitcher, which lets them know where you're at. You're shining a torch. Every person in the Israelite army is holding a torch. They can point out there and say, there they are, there they are, there they are. And then they yell, right? The sword of the Lord and of Gideon, right? And so they've got the lamp or the torch, left hand, in their left hand. They've got the trumpet that they've blown in their right hand. Where's their weapon? Still on their side. Still in the sheath. Still in the sheath there. God doesn't even have them ready to fight when they show themselves to the enemy army. They're not even ready to fight. But by faith, they follow God's instructions. Exactly. How does that play out? You remember the story. Judges 7, 21, 22, and they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. They don't rush them. They don't run into attack. They just stand there, holding the torches. There in verse 22, and the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshiddah in Zeraroth, and to the border of Abimeholah unto Tabath. Now, when they blow those trumpets, and they break those pitchers, and they see those torches, and they hear them yelling, where do they think the Israelites are? In the camp, everywhere. Everywhere. They're in the camp. No way the only 300 people they have would be showing themselves on the outside. Right? No way. They've already got people in the camp. That's why they yelled. That's why they blew the trumpets. That's why they did it. That's the only thing that makes sense to them when they wake up and get startled in the middle of the night. And so what do? They start pulling their swords out and doing what? They just swing it at anything. It's dark in their camp. Right? Who are they killing? Each other. Each other there. They think they're in the camp, and they just start swinging. They're killing each other, right? Until how many died? You remember how many died in that first battle? There were 135,000, and there was only 15 left. So how many died initially? 120,000, right? Why did they kill so many of them? The Midianites are a big group of people. Right? When they wake up and think the Israelites are in the camp and they start killing people, what are they looking for then? A way out. A way to escape. Right? How can they get through this crowd of people? They got to kill enough of them till they can see a way out, see an opening. And they whittle it down to 15,000 people before they actually run there. That's what's happening. But it did take amazing faith for God's people to do exactly what God said and to just stand there and wait, watch what God was doing there. If they'd failed in one detail, what would have happened? They would have died, right? They'd have died, right? 135,000 Midianites against 300 Israelites, they'd have died. Right? But they followed God's instructions. Back here in Hebrews 11:32. Here's the next one. What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak. Now, Barak's a little different character from Israel's history. When Barak comes on the scene, there's actually a woman who's sitting in judgment. She's not a judge. If you see a commentary or something that says Deborah's a judge of Israel, that's not true. She's not. She doesn't fit the description of a judge because she's not a deliverer. She's not a picture of Christ. There, she's not. Who's supposed to be the judge? Barak. Barak's supposed to be the judge. Right? He is not following God's instructions there. And so she is actually trying to encourage him. She's trying to get him to do what God has called him to do, which is to be the deliverer for the people there. To get him to step up, be the judge. In Judges 4, verse 6 and 7, he says, and she sent and called Barak the son of Abinoam out of Kadesh Naphtali, and said unto him, Hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded, saying, Go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and of the children of Zebulun? Well, first of all, why would she ask him that question? God's already tried to get him to do that, right? And now God's told her, you need to tell him to do it. I've told him to do it, and he's not listening. You need to encourage him to do it. Verse 7, he says, And I will draw unto thee to the river Kishon Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude, and I will deliver him into thine hand. Now, Barak doesn't need Deborah to give him that calling of God. He's already gotten it. But he neglected it, so she is trying to encourage him. But he is a bit of a coward, though. He is, right? Especially in the beginning, because the Canaanites that are oppressing Israel at that time, they're being led by that captain, Sisera. You get way more information about Sisera than Jabin, who's the actual king. Sisera is a big deal. He's got 900 chariots. 900 chariots is a big deal in Bible times. That's the most advanced weaponry they have. And he's got a pile of them. He's got a pile of them. There in verse 8, says, And Barak said unto her, If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. Right. You come along, hold my hand, be my security blanket, whatever you want to see it there. But he goes, he leads the 10,000 men into battle. Now that was an act of faith. It was. But her presence is irrelevant, isn't it? What does she do in the battle? That's exactly right. She doesn't do anything. She doesn't lead any of the military people. She's not giving instructions to them. He's the one who's supposed to be the picture of Christ. All she is doing is along for the ride. She's just putting her neck on the line, because if they get beat, she'll get killed too or taken there. But she's not a part of that there. But because she is there, instead of being somewhere else where God could use her, Barak does not get the honor for that victory. God gives it to another woman. And that's an unlikely character who pitched her tent in a convenient location. But God said there in those verses there before that he would bring Sisera's army and those 900 chariots right to Barak and deliver them to his hand there. God does that, by the way, with a tremendous storm. He's talking about the river Kishon there. That tremendous thunderstorm floods that river valley there. When Sisera tries to take his chariots through there, what happens to him? Stuck in the mud. He jumps off on foot. The army goes one way, Sisera goes the other way. No way we're going to stay together. They're going to track us down. And so he flees the opposite direction from his own army on foot. Judges 4:17-20. He says, Howbeit Sisera fled away on his feet to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said unto him, Turn in, my lord, turn in to me, fear not. And when he had turned in unto her into the tent, she covered him with a mantle. And he said unto her, Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. And she opened a bottle of milk and gave him drink and covered him. Again he said unto her, Stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be when any man doth come and inquire of thee, and say, Is there any man here? That thou shalt say, No. Now, that last part there, even among the heathen nations there, a man wouldn't enter a tent of a woman without permission. They wouldn't do that there. And so if she stands at the door and says, There's no man here, any other man that comes by would do what? They just go on. They go on. They wouldn't force their way into her tent there. That was their code of honor. Even among the heathens, they wouldn't do that there. And so, I've left out a verse. Anyway, Judges 4:21. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent and took a hammer in her hand and went softly unto him and smote the nail into his temple and fastened it to the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. Didn't matter if a man was going to come along. As soon as he goes to sleep, she takes that spike and nails him to the ground. But she did that by faith. Barak did that by faith. He took the 10,000 men, led them in, delivered Israel there. But he was a little like Sarah. You remember Sarah was a little harder to get started with her faith. And so was Barak. There in Hebrews 11:32, again, he says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and of Samson." Now, Samson is a familiar character to us. You could read from the end of Judges 13, where Samson is born, all the way through chapter 16, where he dies. There's hardly a dull moment in the life of Samson. In all those chapters there, not hardly a dull moment. Now, they're not all good moments, but they're not dull either. He did live a pretty exciting life. We won't read all those verses. I'm going to give you a summary because most of you are familiar with this. But Samson was born under a Nazirite vow. Now, a Nazirite vow, you had certain eating restrictions. You couldn't eat anything from the fruit of the vine, anything made from grapes, grape juice, raisins, nothing like that. Couldn't eat that. Couldn't touch a dead body. Right? And you couldn't cut your hair until the end of the vow. Now, the longer a man went under that vow, the more shame and humility it brought on him. It was a shame for a man to have long hair in Bible times there. And so that's humbling for him, and that remained until he finished the vow. When he ended the vow, he cut his hair, right? Shaved his head, actually, there. The opposite was true for women. If a woman took a Nazirite vow, there was no shame in her having long hair. But at the end of the vow, what did she have to do? She had to shave it. So her shame came then until it grew back there. And so, but you remember Samson sees a Philistine woman. Just sees her. But he lusts after her. Wants to marry her. Right? Gets his parents' counsel. They arrange the marriage. They go down for the wedding ceremony. They're going to have the wedding feast. A wedding feast would normally last 7 days. Have this whole big ceremony for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, they'd have the ceremony, and that would be it. But you remember at that feast, Samson wants to have a little fun with the Philistine guests. This is in Philistine territory, so it's just him and mom and dad. The rest of the people are Philistines there. He's going to have a little fun. He's going to have a riddle. You remember about him killing the lion? Right? Coming back and finding the honey inside the carcass there that he took of, and he presents that riddle and says, "Oh, how about 30 changes of garments, 30 sheets, 30, my 30 against your 30." Now there's a lot of them, so that wasn't a big deal for them, but that's the riddle he gave. But you remember, they're pressing his future wife for the details about that riddle. They don't want to lose that bet. And she keeps pressing him, and finally he says, "Okay." And he tells her what the riddle is. What does she do? Remember? She goes right straight to her people, tells them what the riddle is, and when the end of the feast comes, they win the bet. You remember how Samson paid the debt? He didn't have 30 changes of raiment, 30 sheets. Remember how he paid the debt? He went and killed 30 Philistines and got it from them. He killed them. But he's so mad about that, he goes home before they have the marriage ceremony. The marriage ceremony happened right at the end of the feast. They're right at the end of the feast. It's the next thing to happen. But he goes home. He wants to pout about it at home because she's betrayed his trust. And while he's home pouting, what did they do with his bride? Gave her to another man. Right? The best man, the one they loaned him to be the best man there at the wedding. After he cools down, he goes back to get her, and that's when he finds out the news. He don't have a wife. She belongs to somebody else now. And in that rage, he catches 300 foxes. You know how hard it is to catch a fox? He gets 300 of them. Right? Holds them tail to tail, takes a branding iron, sets the tails on fire. Any animal you set their tail on fire, what do? They don't stop, drop, and roll, do they? No, they run. And when they run, they go through the wheat fields, they go through the grape vineyards, they go through the olive gardens. And what does that do? It burns it down, burns it down. And the Philistines absolutely furious about that. Israel's still subject to them right now. They're still subject to them. Now, they haven't been delivered yet. Right? And they threaten Israel there, and the Israelites are actually going to give him up to their enemy, to the Philistines there. And Samson says, that's okay. You can bind me, you can deliver me. Just promise you won't kill me yourself in that process. They say, oh, no, we won't do that. We're just going to tie you up and deliver to him. You remember, ties him up, delivers him. As soon as he gets there, what's he do? Oh, he breaks loose and finds what? Laying on the ground. The jawbone of a what? A donkey. Have you ever seen a jawbone of a donkey? Oh, Google that when you get home or when you leave here. It does look like a crazy looking weapon. I mean, it's brutal looking, the way the jaw comes up and the teeth and stuff like that. He takes the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000 men. 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey there. But he's got a problem with women. And so he starts lusting again. This time, he's not going to take a chance on the wife, and he visits a harlot. Visits that harlot, goes in there to the city, and the Philistines find out he's there. They're going to trap him inside the city. Right? When he comes out in the morning, when they open the gates, they're going to be there waiting on him. He gets up at midnight. You remember what he does? He takes both gates, the bars, the posts, everything, puts it on his shoulder, packs it up to the hill, and deposits it by the next city, Hebron. There. Just leaves it. The city is completely exposed, completely open, humiliates them there. After that, he takes another approach. We're not going to visit harlots anymore. We're not going to get married. Just going to shack up with one. That was Delilah, another Philistine woman there. You remember, the Philistine lords had promised her a huge sum of money to find out how they could somehow bind him, how they could afflict him, how they could control him in some way, because it seemed like everything they tried, he broke free. And you remember, Delilah keeps asking him, and oh, you don't love me, or you tell me. And he tells her a few things that are lies, remember, and she catches him and she binds him, and then she says, oh, the Philistines are upon you, and what does he do? He just instinctively breaks them like they're nothing there. And finally, she wears him down, and he says, oh, it's the hair. It's the hair. That ends the Nazirite vow. That's the key. He's still under that Nazirite vow, at least parts of it. And when she cuts his hair, sleeping, he wakes up. They say the Philistines are upon you, and they did bind him and blinded him, cut out his eyes there. And then they tie him to a grinding wheel, which is what they did with animals. You put a mule or something like that on a grinding wheel and make it grind. That's what they did with Samson there. At the end of his life, they're bringing him to a big celebration for their fake god Dagon. Got thousands of people there in this palace there, and they want to make fun of him. You remember he asked the boy that led him there, because he's blind, can't see. He says, "Where's the pillars at?" And he grabs a hold of the pillars, prays to God one last time, and God gives him his strength. He collapses the whole building, kills more in that one event than he killed in his entire lifetime. Now, Samson failed in a lot of ways in his life, but he didn't fail to trust God to strengthen him, even at the end of his life there. And so he's included in that list. There, verse 32, again, you see Jephthah. Now, Jephthah is a little more obscure than most. Jephthah was the son of a harlot. So his dad had a fling with a harlot, and she got pregnant. All the other brothers are full brothers, but he's not. He's the son of a harlot. And so they basically kicked him away from home. Said, no, you're not going to inherit with the true sons, the real sons, with mom, right? And so you're gonna go away. But then they got in a bind. And Jephthah was a really good fighter. He was a really good military man. And they said, oh, well, how about you come back and fight for us? And he says, well, if I can be the leader, I'll come back and fight. And they agreed to it. Jephthah's most famous because he makes a very foolish vow to God. He says, if you let me win, get the victory, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house, which could have been a lamb, could have been a goat, could have been any kind of animal. What was the first thing that came out of his house, though, when he returned home? His only daughter. His only daughter. Now, I don't believe he actually killed her, but she did remain unmarried. She did remain a virgin her entire life, which sacrificed her future in that regard. We leave the book of Judges there. That next one on that list is David. See that in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, the life of David. David's known for his faith before he became king, after he becomes king. But you could spend a lot of time sharing the faith of David, but we've been focusing that on Sunday mornings. So I'm not going to go into those details. You know the story even from Goliath when he marches down there as a shepherd boy at about 15 years old. And then even his faithfulness to Saul, even when Saul's so jealous, he's chasing him all over the countryside trying to kill him, he still remains faithful. I won't stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. Right? Even to the point where he waits like 15 years from the time Samuel anointed him before he actually becomes king there. And you remember when he first becomes king, he's only king over one tribe. Ishbosheth had the other ones, actually Abner, but Ishbosheth was Saul's son. And then he finally gets all 12. Samuel, there's the next one on the list, these heroes of faith. When you get to Samuel, you got to move backward because he comes before David there. He's the last judge of Israel. His sons probably would have taken over after him, but they were horrible. They were horrible. And so they didn't. God delivered that then the leadership to the first king, which was Saul. But Samuel's the one who anointed Saul, the first king of Israel, and he anointed David, who was the next king of Israel. But Samuel faced the Israelites as their judge. They were rebellious against God. Just rebellious against God. They'd been involved in idolatry, and he confronted them about that. With courage and conviction, spoke the truth of God's word to him. But even as a child, do you remember who raised Samuel? Remember who raised him? His mother originally couldn't have children. She goes to the temple. Yes, Eli, the high priest. Remember when she prayed to God, Hannah prayed to God and said, if you'll just give me a son, I'll give him back to you. And she did that literally. He was raised by Eli, by the high priest there. Eli was not such a great father either. His two sons were sons of Belial, unsaved people. They knew not the Lord. And Eli had done some things and allowed them to do some things, and God had quit giving him open vision. And then God starts giving this to Samuel as a boy. And by faith, you remember Samuel, thought that Eli was hollering for him in the middle of the night, calling for him. He come and, no, I didn't call you. He hears it again. He comes, no, I didn't call you. And finally Eli realizes, oh, that's God calling you. Answering. There. But he's the one that anointed David as the next king of Israel while Saul was still king. Now that's an act of faith. That was a life or death kind of situation because Saul didn't accept that. Remember, Saul's trying to kill David. Anybody who he thinks is trying to help David. The priests at Nob that Doeg the Edomite killed there. And Samuel wasn't actually a target of Saul's, but he could have been. He could have been. There at the end of that verse 32, Hebrews 11:32, you see, and the prophets. Now that extends all the way through the Old Testament, right? The last prophet we see in the Old Testament is Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. Right? Now, we don't have any more names after this verse. but you have some descriptions of people that we can identify. Hebrews 11:13, he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. Now, we could associate those who subdued kingdoms. That could have been any of the judges who were the deliverers for Israel there. That could have been some of the kings of Israel or Judah also, those acting in faith by God there. Right? What comes to mind when you think about someone that stopped the mouths of lions, though? Yeah, Daniel. Daniel, the man of God, right? You remember, who would not stop praying. The counselors tricked the king into signing a law that said nobody could ask any petition of man or God for 30 days. The only petition you could make was to the king. And of course, he's kind of puffed up with pride, and he says, yeah, I'll sign that. But who was praying 3 times a day? Daniel, in his window. Right? When the king signed that into law, right? Here's Daniel. Daniel 6:19 through 23. Then the king arose very early in the morning. By the way, Daniel did not hide. He still prayed 3 times a day. Still prayed in front of his window. That's how he ends up in the lion den. Here in Daniel 6:19 through 23, you see the end of that. It says, then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. What's a lamentable voice? Lamentations is the sorrow of Nehemiah. There's no hope. It's very depressing, very sorrowful. He's got that lamentable voice there. He says unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. How about this? Hebrews 11:34. Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, and waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Who quenched the violence of fire? Oh, Daniel's friends, right? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, right? Refused to bow down to the image. Nebuchadnezzar made this great big golden image, right? And said, when you hear the sound of the psaltery and the sackbut and all these different instruments playing, that you'll bow down to it. Right? And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't doing that. Somebody told on them. One of the Chaldeans told on them. There in Daniel 3:16 to 18, he says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. What were they saying when he said, we're not careful to answer in this matter? We don't even have to think about it, right? We don't have to think about it. We know the answer. We're not going to bow down to a statue. It's not God. We're not going to. And either God's going to deliver us through the fire, or God's going to deliver us through death. And we're going to go on to be with him. And either way, perfectly fine with us. Their faith wasn't going to change. Now, there are multiple others there from verse 34 that God delivered from the sword. God gave strength to, gave courage to, all because of their faith. How about verse 35? He says, women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Right? Some were brought back to life. That's what happened with the widow's son with Elijah in 1 Kings 17:22. He says, and the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came unto him again, and he revived. Same thing with the Shunammite woman's son, with the prophet Elisha. That happened in 2 Kings 4:34 and 35. And he went up and lay upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth and his eyes upon his eyes and his hands upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned and walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him. And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Now, they were brought back to life. Now, some were brought back to life. Some died, though. They went on to God through glory there. Hebrews 11:36 to 38. He says, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder. Anybody know traditionally who was sawn asunder? You know what that means, sawn asunder? You stick them inside a hollow log, right, and saw them in half. Saw them in half. You know who you don't have the biblical account of that, but you know who traditionally was sawn asunder? Isaiah. There. He says, we're sawn asunder, we're tempted, we're slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And so you could attach several people to those events. They didn't deserve that harsh treatment. Right? The world didn't deserve to have them. They were trying to share God with the world. They didn't deserve that. They didn't realize it. But in spite of those afflictions, in spite of that adversity, they continued in faith, looking for that better hope, that eternal inheritance. Now, some were looking for a literal fulfillment of prophecy in their lifetime. We saw that with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, but it didn't happen in their lifetime. And yet, when they got to the end of their life, what did they do? They just reminded the next ones. Still, God promised it, still coming. Still coming. There are the last couple of verses. Hebrews 11:39 and 40. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. As we said, they didn't see it happen. They didn't need to see it happen. That's how this chapter started. You remember back in verse 1? Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. They didn't have to see it to know it was true, to put all their hope in eternity in God's hands. That's real faith. We've seen the sacrifice of faith through Abel, the walk of faith through Enoch, the work of faith through Noah, the obedience of faith through Abraham, the perseverance of faith through Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the choice of faith through Moses, and now this is the courage of faith through the judges, the kings, the prophets, even in the face of death or great persecution. Now, our faith can't see the object that we're believing in. We can't see God, literally. But other people can see our faith. They can see it in action. They can see when we're trusting God, whether our life's on the line or whether it's just to make the next bill payment or whatever it is, whatever situation we go through. Now, we'll see one more, actually, as we move into chapter 12. One more example of faith, but that's next week. Lord willing. Any questions or comments this evening?